He has been called the first truly American writer, the true father of our national literature. He has also been called the country's first rock star, a performer whose lectures drew huge audiences all around the world. Writing of his death, the New York Times said he was the greatest humorist this country has produced. And today, there is a national prize in his name to recognize those who create humor from their uniquely American experiences. Author, humorist, lecturer, world traveler, American icon. Samuel Langhorne Clements, Mark Twain. The early years.
Most people believe that I was born in Hannibal, Missouri, but I wasn't. I was born in Florida, Monroe County, Missouri. Why, Florida had a population of 100, and when I arrived, I increased that population by 1%. And that is more than many of the greatest men in history have ever been able to do for a town.
The man we know as Mark Twain was born in 1835 as Samuel Langhorne Clements in the small town of Florida, Missouri. When he was 4 years old, the family moved 35 miles east to Hannibal, a growing port town on the banks of the Mississippi River. Hannibal and the Mississippi would have a profound influence on his life, his writing, and his legacy.
When I was a youngster, I grew up on the banks of the Mississippi River, and I was influenced by the people that I saw coming and going. Why, I watched riverboat pilots. We would always wait to see the riverboat come. My father, why, he wasn't very good at making money. I always said that had my father have been able to make like $5, just $5 more a week, why, I would have been born with auburn hair. Instead, it was red.
Printer, writer, miner, and riverboat pilot. Before Sam was 12, his father died of pneumonia, leaving the family in poor financial circumstances. Sam had to leave school and find work. Sam's first job was as an apprentice typesetter for local newspapers like the Hannibal Gazette and the Missouri Courier. After 2 years, he went to work at the Hannibal Journal, a newspaper owned by his oldest brother Orion, where he was a printer and editorial assistant. Sam discovered, at this early age, that he liked to write. His first known published work was a sketch called The Gallant Fireman. It appeared in his brother's paper. Seeking a wider audience, he sent a short piece called The Dandy Frightening the Squatter to the Carpetbag, a Boston humor magazine. But the author didn't use his full name. He was identified only with initials, S.L.C. After almost 3 years of working for his brother, Sam left Hannibal and traveled to New York, St. Louis, Philadelphia, Keokuk, Iowa, and Cincinnati. He supported himself by working as a journeyman typesetter. It would be the first leg in a lifetime of travel. In 1857, Sam left Cincinnati on the riverboat the Paul Jones and headed to New Orleans. From there, he planned on going to Brazil to make a fortune in trade cocoa. It was the first of many get-rich-quick schemes he would look for all his life. But when he got to New Orleans, Sam discovered there were no boats leaving for South America. So instead, he took another course. He asked Horace Bixby, a pilot on the Paul Jones, to train him as a riverboat pilot. In April 1859, after a year and a half working under Bixby, Sam Clemens was officially licensed to pilot steamboats to and from St. Louis and New Orleans. And for the next 2 years, that is what he did. Then, in 1861, the Civil War put a stop to all trade on the Mississippi. So ended Sam's career as a riverboat pilot.
The river flow stopped. I finally had become a pilot. And the north stopped flow from the south, and the south stopped flow from the north, and the only traffic on the river, was munitions and so on. I wasn't going to have any part of that. So I went out west.
He soon joined his brother Orion in the Nevada Territory. Orion, an avid Republican, had been given a job out west as a reward for his support of Abraham Lincoln's presidential campaign.
Well, I begged Orion, and I begged him to take me with him. And he did take me with him as his secretary. So I had the dubious distinction of being secretary to the secretary of the Midwestern Territories for a little bit of time.
Thinking again that he could strike it rich, Sam tried mining. By his own admission, he wasn't very good at it, and his life as a miner didn't last long. So he found a new career, became a reporter for the Virginia City Territorial Enterprise.
And I was a terrible miner. So I took a job with the local newspaper. There was a wagon train, that was headed out west to California. And I was given a job to interview the head of that wagon train. And when I went to interview him, he was a terrible gentleman. I didn't like him at all. So when I went back to the office, I sat down and I decided that he was going to be leaving town, and that I could probably write whatever I wanted to write about him. So I invented this whole story of how he was ambushed by Indians and the entire wagon train was wiped out and so on. And sure enough, about 2 days later, word came back that they had in fact been ambushed and they were wiped out. So right then and there I found out that I could invent the news.
Samuel Clemens becomes Mark Twain. On February 3, 1863, Samuel Clemens wrote a humorous article for the Territorial Enterprise and signed it not with his real name, but with a pseudonym. He had used many pen names before: W. Epaminondas Adrastus Blab, Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass, Sergeant Fathom, among others. Now he chose a new name, Mark Twain. Mark Twain is actually a river term that means 2 fathoms or 12 feet deep. It signals that the water is deep enough to navigate safely. Mark Twain would be the pen name for the rest of his life.
Why, very rarely in my time did you write under your own name. After all, if I wrote under a pen name, I could say whatever I wanted to, and it would never come back to look askance at my family. So I could say what I believed, and I could say it under the name of Mark Twain, or I could say it under one of the other names that I used to use, and I had 2 or 3.
Sam had to leave Nevada because he was involved in a duel. Eventually, the charges were dropped. That same year, living in California, he had his first major success as a writer. His short story, Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog, was published in the New York Saturday Press. The story received rave reviews and was reprinted by newspapers around the country. In no time, its author, Mark Twain, was a nationally known humorist. The following year, Mark Twain embarked on yet another career, travel writer.
I began travel writing. I would write letters back by the newspapers, and they'd pay me to write. and I liked that. I would go and I would watch and I'd see what occurred, and then I'd write about it and occasionally receive a check, and that was a good thing.
Continuing his work as a travel writer, he sailed on the Quaker City to Europe and the Holy Lands. The trip would lead to an all-important event in Sam Clements' life.
I took the first actual transatlantic pleasure cruise aboard the Quaker City. And I was traveling as a travel writer. I met a young gentleman named Charlie Langdon. Well, Charlie, he used to carry an ivory miniature of his sister, Olivia. The minute that I saw it, why, I fell in love. Why, that was the girl for me. I told Charlie that someday she was going to be my wife. Why, she was just lovely. I asked her about 3 times to marry me. Why, each time she turned me down. Well, her father finally decided. He asked for a letter of recommendation, and he wanted to know my friends, so he could send them a letter and then find out what they thought about me. Well, the letters came back. One of them said, "Why, I'm surprised that he hasn't wound up in a drunkard's grave." And the other one was that I'm surprised he hasn't been succumbed to the hangman's noose. Well, finally he came to me and he said, "Sam," he said, "it appears you don't have any friends." I said, "I tell you what," he said, "I'll be your friend." He said, "You've never lied to me. We know who you are." And he gave me his daughter's hand in marriage.
Fame and controversy. In 1869, The Innocents Abroad, a story based on his trip, was published. The humorist's account of Europeans from an American point of view became a commercial and critical success. Mark Twain was more and more in demand.
I think I was always a bit surprised that people purchased what I wrote. But I wrote about life, and I think I was a bit surprised initially, but then I realized that I had a flair for it.
In 1870, Sam and Livy married and set up home in Buffalo, New York. The following year, they and their young son moved to Hartford, Connecticut. It was here, in this house, over the next 20 years, that Mark Twain would write his most famous books. All his experiences, his boyhood in Missouri, his life as a pilot on the Mississippi, his years out west, his travels abroad, his observations of American society, can be found in his books. Roughing It recounts his years out west as a miner and newspaper reporter. The Gilded Age talks about the excesses of the post-Civil War years in America. In fact, that period of history took its name from the book. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer draws on his boyhood years on the Mississippi. A Tramp Abroad describes Twain's adventures through Germany and the Alps. Life on the Mississippi recalls his experiences as a riverboat pilot and his memories of a visit back to the area more than 2 decades later. And Huckleberry Finn, the book that is considered to be Twain's masterpiece. All modern American literature, Ernest Hemingway said, comes from Huckleberry Finn. There was nothing before. There has been nothing as good since.
I started to write Huckleberry Finn before I began writing Tom Sawyer. And I found that I didn't like the manuscript at all of Huckleberry Finn. Of course, it wasn't called Huckleberry at the time. So I pigeonholed it for about 7 years and took up writing another boys' book. I was going to write a book for boys, and it wound up being The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And shortly after that, well, as I said, about 7 years after that, I picked up the manuscript and started writing again one summer in Elmira and here in Hartford. And I wrote like crazy. I found that it just flowed.
One thing that set Mark Twain apart from other writers was his style, his use of the American language.
I wrote in American dialect, and I was rather unique for that. As a matter of fact, I think I was the first author, in this country anyway, to write in American dialect. If you were from the South, I made you sound like you were from the South, and I wrote that way. Prior to that, it was all the King's English. So people that read my book, or read Huckleberry Finn, well, I heard the way it was, and that's the way I wanted to write. I wanted it to be real, and I wanted you to feel that you were in the room with someone that actually spoke that way.
Although it would become a classic, not everyone at the time praised Huckleberry Finn. Life magazine objected to its blood-curdling humor and coarse and dreary fun. The Concord, Massachusetts Public Library called the book trash and banned it from its shelves. And author Louisa May Alcott said that if Mr. Clemens cannot think of something better to tell our pure-minded lads and lasses, he had better stop writing for them.
As far as writing is concerned, I think you shouldn't hold anything back. I should put it all out there.
The controversy over Huckleberry Finn continues to this day. Some critics think the book should be banned from schools for using a racial epithet in referring to one of the main characters, Jim, a runaway slave. One publisher has even brought out an edited version which sanitizes the language. Apparently, Samuel Clemens welcomed the controversy. He saw the Concord Library ban as an immediate boost to sales. This he welcomed because Huckleberry Finn was the first book published by Charles L. Webster and Company, a business he started with and named for his nephew. Huckleberry Finn was only a moderate success, but the company soon had an enormous bestseller, The Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. Grant gave his book to Charles L. Webster and Company after Clemens promised to pay him twice as much as any other publisher. Memoirs would be a bonanza for the Grant family and its publisher. Successful author, lecturer, publisher, and business failure. With the success of his own books, his lectures, and his publishing company, Samuel Clemens was living a life of fame and fortune. Mark Twain had achieved a level of popularity unknown to any other American writer.
My lecturing brought me a good deal of money. Probably was one of the most lucrative, immediate ways to make money. There was a tremendous amount of traveling involved, and I traveled all over the world to give a lecture. I might travel for a month, to go and speak for an hour or so. But I would also have a New England tour that I did every winter, and I used to make about $2,000 per winter season, just traveling around New England and speaking.
The money was pouring in, and Sam thought he could do no wrong. The house in Hartford where he, Livy, and their 3 daughters lived was an indication of the high life he attained.
I always like to tell people, welcome to my home. We have all the modern inconveniences. When you enter our home, you come into the entryway and you'll be greeted by George Griffin. He's our butler and quite a marvelous gentleman. He's been here for years and years. When I can't sleep, I go up and I rattle his cage, so to speak, and get him out of bed and we go play billiards. But George would meet you in the entryway, and then he would take you to the drawing room where he would present you to my wife, Olivia. And perhaps there'd be someone playing the piano. We have a lovely piano in there. And there's another fireplace in that room. We have fireplaces in all the rooms in the house. We also have a central heating system, which is rather unique. I always tell people to shut that door, I say. Not that it lets in the cold air, but it lets out the coziness.
Despite his success, Sam continued to look for the get-rich-quick schemes that did not make money. He bought and sold stocks that didn't do well. He also invested massive amounts of money in a new automatic typesetting machine designed by James L. Page. All of this was a severe drain on his resources. At the same time, his publishing company had become less and less profitable, and his own novel, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, published in 1886, did not achieve the sales of some of his previous works. Faced with dwindling income and enormous expenses, in 1891 the Clements family moved to Europe. It would be less expensive for them to live there. Meanwhile, he tried to salvage his finances and find new investors for the failing Page typesetting machine. The Panic of 1893, a nationwide economic collapse, added to his plight. He was on the brink of disaster. He was rescued from complete financial ruin by Henry H. Rogers, a multimillionaire and vice president of Standard Oil. In 1894, under Rogers' advice, Charles L. Webster and Company declared bankruptcy, and Sam finally conceded that the Page typesetter was a failure. It was enormous personal defeat. Rogers managed to arrange the bankruptcy so that the family would not lose their Hartford home. And looking out for his friend's reputation, Rogers convinced Sam to publicly promise to repay all his debts in full. The World Traveler and Public Commentator. To make money, Mark Twain once again turned to the lecture circuit. This time he toured the world, making nearly 150 appearances on 5 continents in 11 months. It was a grueling trip. They looked forward to being in London, where their other 2 daughters, Susie and Jean, would join them. But soon after they got there, news came that Susie, back in Hartford, was sick. Livy and Clara sailed home. Alone in London, Samuel got the news that Susie had died. While mourning the death of his daughter, Mark Twain wrote Following the Equator, a book based on his world tour. The year before, a book he had been working on for some time was published, The Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc. While not all that well received, it held a special place for him.
Favorite thing I ever wrote was Joan of Arc. And why? I believe it's a little bit different, and it takes a turn from my normal writings, which were travel writings, and I've written about just about everything. So it was different, and I liked that very much.
Later in his life, Samuel Clemens said that his descriptions of Joan of Arc were based on his daughter Susie. Perhaps that is why it was his favorite book. She had been his favorite daughter. Between the money he earned on his tour and the sales of his books, Samuel Clemens was able to repay all his debts. In October 1900, the family returned to the United States. But they could not go back to their home in Hartford. It was too painful to be there without Susie. So the family set up in New York City, where Mark Twain was welcomed home as a hero. People sympathized with the loss of his daughter and praised him for having repaid all his debts. But Sam had changed. Instead of writing mainly humorous stories and articles of everyday life, Mark Twain wrote political commentary, much of it contrary to the widely held sentiments of the day. He spoke out against anti-Semitism and racial inequality. He spoke in favor of giving women the vote. He was an advocate for workers' rights and supported the overthrow of the Russian Tsar. And, contrary to the popularly held opinion of the day, he spoke out against colonialism and imperialism, Still, Mark Twain remained popular with his public, and he made many personal appearances. But Samuel Clemens's private life was slowly diminishing. The later years. In 1904, Livy died of heart failure. He sold the family house in Hartford and built Stormfield in Redding, Connecticut. While the house was being built, he traveled to England to receive an honorary Doctorate of Letters degree from Oxford University. Surrounded by literary giants of the time, Rudyard Kipling, George Bernard Shaw, and others, he was pleased to say that a cyclone of applause followed his introduction. In June 1908, Sam moved into his new home. An avid reader, he had a vast collection of books, many more than the house could handle. So he donated 3,000 of them and $6,000 to start a library in Redding for his neighbors.
I read everything, and I started, not only did I read it, I would comment on it. But if you ever find a book that I have read, you'll see in the margins, if I don't like what the author has written, I'll change it.
Sam hoped he would be able to recreate the life he had in Hartford in his new home, but he never would. The year after he moved in, his daughter Jean, who had long suffered from epilepsy, died there in an accident on Christmas Day. He continued to write articles and essays and worked on his autobiography, but his health continually deteriorated. On April 21, 1910, Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, died. He was 74 years old. Upon hearing of his death, President William Howard Taft said, "Mark Twain gave pleasure, real intellectual enjoyment to millions, and his works will continue to give such pleasure to millions yet to come, as they still do today."